right, everybody. Welcome back to the Climbing Majority podcast. We're sitting down here with Scott Johnston today. First off, Scott, when we spoke earlier, I didn't really realize that we had decided to meet on the holiest of days on February 14th on Valentine's Day. So I just want to apologize to your wife that you're here, having a recording with us, but we're very appreciative to have you here. And how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. And I don't think it's not going to impact our relationship. We've been together for almost 40 years. So
yeah, no, that's good to hear. Kyle and I were talking before, the show came on, and we were saying essentially, I don't really celebrate dates like that. It's like another day or a birthday or, some other day is totally fine, or I'll get the discount chocolate in a couple of days. So, but, happy to hear we haven't caused any, marital discrepancies or issues for yourself. So.
No marital stress. No.
Okay, perfect. But I think we'll just jump right into a question here we have for you, Scott. And so the first thing we wanted to start with today was, why does an individual such as yourself who graduates, college with a mechanical engineering degree and a minor in mathematics become an endurance coach?
Oh, gosh. Well, that's a good question. I can tell you, I'll give you the short story, which is that, I had a bit of a professional athletic career myself as a cross-country skier, and short and rather not very illustrious at the World Cup level. But when I quit racing, I moved to a little place in north central Washington that had a really active junior ski program. And the woman who was coaching it was pregnant and about to have a kid. And she knew that I had this background. She said, "Hey, would you coach the team?" And I said, "You bet. Sure. I'm happy to." And then for like a lot of times when we say things, we often realize later, oh God, what did I get myself into? And I realized later I didn't know, much. I didn't know anything about coaching kids. I had kind of had a casual layperson study of exercise, physiology, and endurance because I'd been involved in endurance sports since I was a child. Swam at quite a high level when I was a kid. And so I had some understanding because I'd been involved in 2 Olympic development programs that I was exposed to sports scientists, and I got a lot of testing done on myself and that sort of thing. And I was curious, so I read a lot, but I didn't know anything about coaching kids. And so I bought a couple of books about coaching kids. One of them was a Norwegian coaching training manual, and Norwegians, of course, are famous for producing top cross-country skiers, so I figured they would know what they were talking about. And the other was written by a Hungarian guy. It was kind of general coaching for kids sort of strategies. And I dove into that, and when I realized I really enjoyed learning about that stuff. And so I made a pretty deep dive into it, and we had a big program, about 120 kids in the program, and I was responsible for the high school age kids that were pretty serious in their racing. And I managed over the course of a few years to produce several junior national champions who went on to World Junior Championships and performed well, and then moved on to the U.S. ski team and went to several Olympics, produced a number of national champions and world champion podiums people. So I realized I was doing something right, even though I had no official training in that background. I didn't have an exercise science degree or anything like that. And a couple of those kids that left my program or left high school, they continued to work with me as a coach, and I coached them at a higher level. And then I started to attract other young skiers to the program that I was coaching, skiers that were competing on the World Cup level. And so I was traveling to Europe a lot and being involved in that. And so that's sort of the short story. And that's actually during that time is when I began to coach Steve House, who I co-wrote that first book with, Training for the New Alpinism. And, but like I alluded to a moment ago, this goes back to, childhood, really, when I started swimming. And then I had a high school coach that kind of instilled this curiosity about training, physiology and training science. And we turned out to have a very good high school team. And I competed in college. And then, as I said, I was part of this Olympic development program in swimming. So I guess it goes back a long way for me. And even though I don't have, any letters behind my name that would suggest I know anything about coaching and training, I've managed to put it together, kind of learning on my own, I suppose, and educating myself.
Yeah, well, I think there's no substitute for competency, and obviously your resume and pedigree kind of speaks for itself. I'm wondering for yourself, like growing up, did you ever suffer from anxiety, depression? Like, of course, everybody nowadays talks about like mental health and they pathologize everything, but like it's such a common theme. We talk to people who are mountain athletes, and there's almost like this, like the pain cave. It's like they're running from something, is that something that characterized yourself, like growing up through your youth?
I don't think that was, not really. No. I think I had the normal insecurities that most of us have. And I think, I was driven to try to perform at as high a level as I could. It was, one of the reasons I pursued the studies I did in school was I thought, okay, well, this is stuff I would never pick up a book after I get out of college and read about. So I'm going to try to learn things in school that I wouldn't be able to, or I wouldn't have the discipline to sit down and read, a book on differential equations. But whereas I'm curious about a lot of other stuff, and I think there's a lot you can learn from books, but this was stuff that I knew I wouldn't do. So I kind of had that bent in most of my life, which was, hey, this looks challenging, let's try it. It was kind of what actually got me involved in climbing when I was, into climbing when I was in high school. Same sort of thing. I was, that looks pretty cool. It looks hard, it looks scary. I wonder if I could do that kind of thing. And so, but I don't think I had the any sort of, other than, like I said, probably the normal self-doubts and whatnot that most people have. Yeah.
Scott, I'm curious, in the way you spoke about your progression to coaching, it was almost as you were kind of thrown into it in a professional role right away. And you said that you immediately realized you didn't know how to teach children. It was almost this roadblock you had to overcome. And so I'm curious as to what about the difference in children and adults was like, what caused that awareness? What about children was different? And then how does that, and if it does, apply back to how you coach adults?
Well, I think I didn't really, I should preface this or go back and amend what I said perhaps earlier, that I didn't know how to coach anybody. I mean, I had been an athlete myself and I had been coached, but until you actually have to apply coaching theory to people, there's a big difference between being on the receiving end and, the administering end of this stuff. So I guess it was a double awareness that I had. One that I really didn't know that much about coaching, but I certainly didn't know anything about coaching kids. And so the difference with, and this, I think, a common mistake and something I've actually lectured about quite often now to people, is respecting the uniqueness of children. Is that there are certain developmental stages that kids go through during which their bodies are more accepting of and adaptable to different kinds of training stimulus. So for instance, speed and power and agility and skills and that sort of thing are much easier learned in the, say, 7 to 12-year-old years, when you're starting to develop enough coordination that you can control your body the way you want it to, but your nervous system is still plastic enough to learn learn new skills, physical skills. And then as you get older, then there's a point where you can begin to increase the loading on the body. So strength training becomes more appropriate. And then in the early to, let's say through puberty especially, is when kids are especially easily adapted to endurance training. and strength training as well, but especially endurance training. It's when your heart is growing the fastest. And so you can make huge gains. And the mistake that I think a lot of coaches that I've seen over the years that coach kids is they try to mimic or try to apply an adult program to a kid. And so they try to train, like I'm going to speak specifically about skiing here because that's where my expertise is. But they'll look at some World Cup, 27-year-old World Cup Norwegian skier and think, oh, well, look at how good this skier is and what he does for training volume and all that. Well, why don't we have our 14-year-olds do the same thing? And first of all, that 27-year-old World Cup skier has probably been progressing through his training since he was 9 or 10 years old to get to that stage. And he has a much higher work capacity than a kid will have. And I see it often that you try to train a child like an adult and don't train them through these appropriate stages of skill building. And I think the number one thing for kids is that it has to be fun. And especially endurance sports, they're not really fun. They're repetitive, they're boring. It's hours and hours of time by yourself. And if you're a 12-year-old and your friends are in the gym in the evenings playing volleyball and you're out skiing around in the dark with a headlamp for 2 hours, it's going to be hard for that 12-year-old to stay focused on that sport unless there's some elements of fun that are involved. And so if you start, again, trying to flog them like a 25-year-old, they burn out. I've just seen that happen a lot, especially in junior high school is where the big burnout in endurance sports with kids comes.
I think to further the topic of something you're talking about in youth is essentially like not having a flame burn so bright that it burns out. You need to keep things fun. You need to keep the person kind of active and engaging in that. And then also have these late developers, have their chance and not burn out the early developers. So like a question we have here is kind of, and this could apply to the youth, but I think it's more so to the adult realm. What is the allure of endurance sports for an individual such as yourself?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people that are attracted to endurance sports failed at team sports. They didn't have the innate athleticism, perhaps, to become on the varsity basketball team or whatever, and so they gravitate towards the high school cross country running team. And there's an old saying was famous years and years ago. I don't know who said it, some running coach, and that was that sprinters are made. You are born with that athletic talent to be a sprinter. Sprinters are born with that talent. Distance runners are made. And I have coached people who had that sprinter athleticism, the very athletic, people who can do double back flips on cross country skis off of a big cliff jump. I've coached people like that, believe it or not. Well, those people, I can take anybody and turn them into an endurance athlete. But you can't take somebody who doesn't have those athletic genes and you're not going to get that person to be able to dunk a basketball or be a running back in the NFL. So I think that our evolutionary process has genetically predisposed us towards endurance. And so it's kind of the last resort for people who like sports but aren't athletic enough to do some of the real athletic sports. They're not going to be, like I said, NFL running backs. But I think it's a different mentality too. They call those team sports are called games for a good reason. You play a game. These endurance sports are not games. They're, it's an individual test of yourself against, other people, against yourself. And I think for most people who are involved in team sports, by the time they're out of, high school, and maybe, most people aren't even going to play those team sports in college. That's the end. They're 18 years old and that's their end of their sporting life. Whereas people who are involved in endurance sports, it's a lifetime activity. It's something that because they don't need a team. They don't need a hoop and a basketball court. They just need to go put on some running shoes and go out the door. So I think it's a different motivators really that drive people in those two different directions.
I haven't heard the athletic dropout theory for endurance sports. I would say I fall into the category of not enjoying team sports in the first place. Just not having to rely on a team for your performance. Really, it's like you're with endurance sports and climbing and these things where it's under your own power. Like you said, it's a test for yourself. And that's what like the allure for me is. But the athletic dropout is interesting.
No, I think that was in my case, maybe I'm biased because of this, but I was one of those kids that in junior high, I mean, I think I probably tried out for every team sport that our schools, baseball, basketball, football. And I got to be so bad that the coaches would recognize, okay, here comes that kid. Don't even bother giving him pads for the football practice because we know 2 days later he's going to be cut off the team.
Wow.
And yeah. So luckily I found that I had a penchant for endurance. I ran in high school and swam as well. And I really thrived in those sports. So, but I think I'm kind of I would say, Kyle, I'm like you in that for me, I mean, life isn't a spectator sport. And yet for most people, the appeal of team sports is to be a spectator, to watch other people do those sports. I mean, maybe they played football in high school, but now they're spectators of other people playing football. Whereas that has never held an appeal to me. I've always been the person who, I want to be doing the thing, not watching other people do it. I mean, I don't even watch, even when I was coaching cross country ski racing, I probably rarely watched a televised ski race. I mean, I would watch the races I was standing on the sidelines of course. But even now, I don't keep up with who's doing what in cross country ski racing anymore, and just because it's like, okay, well, it's not as intimate to me as it once was, and what do I benefit from it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. I 100% agree. I think it's funny how certain people will know more about a player's life than their own. And that kind of mentality just does not resonate with me, and I don't understand it. There's so much to do. There's so much life to live to be worried about somebody else's.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought to chase out a little bit there. I find myself, I don't really watch team sports or anything, the occasional hockey game or something I'll go to if there's cheap tickets or whatever. But most of the time, even in relation to climbing, I'm incredibly inspired by the content I watch, and I do watch a fair amount of climbing content, but it's almost through the lens of motivation. Like as I'm watching it, it's just getting me like psyched and like totally driven to go out and climb. And I'm envisioning myself like, of course, it's preposterous to like envision yourself in some of these positions people are doing, but you can still grab that kind of motivation and that like osmosis of it almost in a way. It's really not from like a spectator's perspective. It's almost like putting juice in the tank to like get me to go out more, if that makes sense. Like, do you find yourself when you spectate anything?
Yeah, I think, when I watch, let's say, a World Cup cross country ski race on YouTube, or I watch a climbing, someone climbing, for me, it's often like I want to learn how are they doing that? What is it they're doing that makes them so good at this thing that they're doing? Yes, there's certainly motivation. Although for me, I'm quite the armchair athlete these days. I mean, I'm 70 years old, so I have no dreams of being able to do some of those things, but it is exciting and motivating to see what people are capable of. But it's often for me looking at, okay, what is it that is enabling them to do this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of talked about this a little bit earlier on where, in your youth, you were saying you have this proclivity to, endurance training beyond the point that just genetically most people, you can do the, slow twitch, type 1 adaptation much easier than you can do a 2x adaptation. So I'm wondering though, like in relation to grit and like toughness, is this something that you feel like you're either born with or can you cultivate it? Does that make sense?
Well, it's certainly the number one most important characteristic of an endurance athlete is the perseverance. because by the very definition of endurance is suffering. I mean, it's every contest of endurance is a contest of who can suffer the most for the longest. And so it's kind of a perverse activity in a way, I suppose. But again, I think that I truly believe that we are evolutionarily predisposed for that. I mean, that is what enabled Homo sapien to rise to the top of the food chain. And it's still in our genes, even though, today we do not have to go out and chase the antelope for 2 days till it exhausts itself so we can kill it. But we still have that in us. And it's been detuned. It's been, it's not necessary for people to live that way anymore. But I think people like, the idea of going out and running a 100-mile race, for instance, I mean, why on the earth would someone run 100 miles these days? I mean, it's absolutely, but yet all of these ultra endurance races, they have huge waiting lists. It's very hard to get into them. So there's something that is innately appealing to people about this type of thing. Now, I think that it also, might relate a little bit to, for most people, it's like, okay, they're not going to, these are more contests of the ability to finish, and for most of the participants. I mean, obviously there's an elite few at the front who are running quite fast, and this is a contest of speed for them. But for many, it's just a contest. Can I actually do this thing? Can I run for 28 hours? But so I do think that it does take a certain amount of grit. But I think perseverance is perhaps a better word. It's, the ability to, and this was one of the things that I always stressed with the kids that I coached is, and I think this is one of the most valuable lessons of individual sports, is the learning to fail. And because in a team, when you win or when you lose, there's a whole other there's everybody else on the team that either suffers the disgrace of losing or shares in the adulation of the victory. But when you scroll down the finish list of the race and you're down there in 48th place, then there's no dodging that. I mean, you have to face up. I mean, maybe 48th place was a really good race for you, but whatever it is, you have to come to grips with your own performance on that day and how you did. There's no excuses. And I think that for the kids, you as adults, we know this now, that one of the most important things I think to have a successful life is to be robust enough that when you fail, you can pick yourself, like you guys did with your ankle injuries. You didn't just roll over and give up. You picked yourself up. You said, okay, what do I do? How do I get better? How am I going to live with these limitations from these injuries? And I think that that's such an important characteristic that if kids don't learn that, to fail and then to try again, failing well, I think is a really important skill in life. And so that was one of my big, when we set goals for the kids for their races, it was often not a performance goal. It was some sort of personal thing. I had a girl who was, scared on the downhills, and I would say, okay, your goal this race is to not snowplow on any of the downhills. And I didn't care. She's still dead last in the race. Doesn't matter to me. She achieved her own little personal victory there. So I think there's a lot to be learned from endurance sports in terms of, you have a lot of time to think about what's, yourself and how you're coping with this suffering component that we talked about earlier.
You had, there's the side of the mental aspect of grit or perseverance, as you said, but there's this other side to the mentality of sports where I think it can you can become too invested in your outcomes or your performance. Have you had experience with athletes dealing with this where too much of their ego or too much of their identity is wrapped up in outcome-based judgment or performance-based judgment? And if so, how do you coach someone to get past this?
Yes, I do see that, or have seen it. And, for professionals, that is a problem, because this is their stated profession is to perform at the elite level in whatever these sports are. And what I've seen is that I'm not sure I can coach that, honestly, but I have seen that the most successful ones that I've worked with, they had something else going on in their life that, certainly their identity is heavily tied to their sport, but it's not everything. And so, it could be, there could be some charity work. It could be school. I've had athletes who, when they were competing on the World Cup in skiing, were also in school. So they were studying, and they had to do long distance, sometimes from, taking classes in the middle of the night in Europe from, the US, to be online classes. And so I think that they're having that and another outlet is a good thing, and it also can help with, everyone's athletic career comes to an end at some time. I should not say that. Every elite athlete's career comes to an end at some point. They're going to be faced with the reality that they're no longer at the top of the heap, and they better have a backup plan, or the transition back to being a normal civilian is going to be very difficult for those that don't have some kind of exit strategy or backup plan. And so I think cultivating some other skill set and certainly other interests is an important thing. And you do see it, probably some of the worst cases of it is with the amateurs, where they think that what makes a professional is this 100% dedication and focus. And so they become completely obsessed and 100% dedicated and focused on what they're doing. And they think that that's the goal that's the route to success. But in fact, what it can do is it can make what they're doing turn into more of a compulsion. And that, especially in endurance sports, because of the monotony and the huge volume of training time that's involved, if it's a compulsion, it's not going to work out. It's not going to last well. I mean, you have to love being out there, spending hours and hours by yourself doing this thing over and over again every day. And if it becomes a compulsion, then you see it manifest itself in unfortunate ways, whether it's eating disorders or, overuse injuries, that kind of thing. So I don't have a great answer for you other than my observation that I've seen the most successful people have other things going on in their life.
No, I think that's right along the narrative that, I personally believe and found after my accident was that I needed something else in my life to be more of a well-rounded individual. And I think it's just an important narrative to share because, like you said, that dedication is like, go live in your van, go live at the crag, go climb all the time, do nothing but climb and be a homeless person, basically. The allure is there to a certain extent, but it's not, it can easily turn into what you said is compulsion. And you lack a foundation to fall back on when, you don't become a professional athlete or you start to not perform as well as you think you ought to be. So it's just an important thing to share, I think.
Yeah, I think just to add a few things to that is like, I think in anything in life, just throwing every single one of your marbles at a singular, problem is problematic. Like anything you over-identify with, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're just 110% and you haven't diversified the things you want to do, for exactly as Kyle alluded to, when you shatter both your ankles or your father gets cancer or, something terrible happens in your life and the number one thing which you have, invested every single inch of yourself and little bit of time, when you don't have that anymore, it's taken away from you, you're just completely lost as an individual, And so I think in life, like being lazy is going to be really difficult. being too busy is going to be really difficult. You kind of have to choose your difficult. But if you have a lot of different projects and a lot of different things that you're investing your time and your energy in that are fulfilling, and you're, operating within this balance, like, you need to have your family and your spouse, or, all these other things are super meaningful parts of your life that you have to juggle appropriately. And anything too much in overdrive is gonna, you're kind of racing towards a red light essentially at some point, if that makes sense. I'm wondering, because you were talking in relation to like a lot of your athletes and kind of pursuing excellence essentially, in your career, both for yourself with your youth athletes and the professional athletes and just normal individuals you work with, do you find that satisfaction and accomplishment are strongly correlated?
I think it depends on what you mean by accomplishment. It's a little bit like my little girl I was telling you about with the snowplow. If she accomplished that race without snowplowing on the downhills, then she was going to be satisfied, because we made sure it was an attainable goal for her. And it was one that when she achieved it, she would be satisfied. And it sets her up for the next goal, the next sort of process goal that would make that we can set up for her. I think that one of the mistakes, and I think this is so common now because of the easy access we have through social media, the internet, of seeing these elite performers. You didn't used to, like when I was first started climbing when I was in high school, we had a couple climbing magazines that came out monthly or bi-monthly. And that if you wanted to find out what happened in climbing, you had to wait a couple months. And you certainly didn't see, real time, GoPro videos or whatever of people doing their thing. And so we weren't exposed to that level of excellence. And I think it's been a good thing in terms of, almost all these sports, of elevating the level of more people. There's more people climbing hard now because they can see how other people climb hard. So it's a good thing. But at the same time, it can, there's a tiny, 1/1000th of 1% that is going to be an Alex Honold or an Alex Migos. And I think it can be we can set ourselves up with a lot of sort of unfortunately unrealistic expectations that, I too could do that. Well, there's a very slim chance that you'll ever be able to do that. There's a reason there's a handful of people that can perform at this level. It's because it's an incredible, not only does it take a lot of time and effort, but you have to have the right genetic makeup. And unfortunately, training can only go so far in terms of, making up for that lack of genetic talent that's, again, one of the nice things about endurance sports is in general, there's a little bit more level playing field. People there's a wider array of people that can succeed in endurance sports, I think, than let's say a high skill, high strength, high power sport, like let's say rock climbing, for instance. When Steve and I were lecturing or traveling around with our first book tour, one of the things I said, and I know he repeats this still, Steve was not a particularly good athlete, but Steve had an incredible amount of perseverance and grit that allowed him to achieve the things he did in the mountains, because they were predominantly, feats of endurance with some fairly demanding climbing, but not, cutting edge, like, let's say, some of the top climbers are doing today. But so I think that we have to keep it in perspective that, yes, you may go live in your van and you may do nothing but eat, sleep, train, and climb. But, if in 4 or 5 years of doing that, you are still climbing 513, then the problem is that you probably just don't have the genetics, sadly. And you're going to, at some point, you have to recognize that.
I think you just crushed probably half our audience's dreams. No, but I think it's a super healthy narrative, and I agree with you.
I'd like to just I don't know if push back would be the right term, but like I just categorically completely agree with everything you just said on like the genetic level, especially when you're talking of like the silence 515, Adam Ondra grade and stuff. Like that's just like insane. But in relation to Steve, I've kind of wondered this, and I wonder what your opinion of this is. What do you think would have happened if Steve never did any endurance or alpinism or anything, and all he did was dedicate all of his time to rock climbing? What kind of a grade do you think Steve would have reached?
13A.
Yeah. Okay. So you think like that was just like genetically?
Well, I know it. I know it because there was about a 2 or 3 year period where Steve moved to Terrebonne, Oregon, right next to Smith Rock, and pretty much exclusively focused on rock climbing.
Yeah.
And he, I'm trying to think of the name of that climb. He red pointed a 13A after like 2+ years of, focused training on. So it's a good grade. There's nothing, it's not just nothing to sneeze about, but it wasn't going to be a 515 climber. I'm pretty sure of that. His legs are too big and heavy.
I haven't heard that before, so that just 100% solidified, I think, what you said earlier. That's really interesting. In relation to genetics, this is maybe a little tangential, but two things. First off, I don't know, did you hear about Kelvin Kiptum just passing away recently?
I did, sadly. Yeah,
that's so terrible, unbelievable. Terrible news, what a tragic, accident for him and his coach. Beyond that, what I'm wondering is, in the endurance community, we don't really see, and maybe I'm wrong, could be my ignorance, but I don't really see like the Kenyan representation in the ultra kind of endurance community that much. And I'm wondering if maybe you had any insights, why do we not see a Kiptum or a Kipchoge in Western States 100? What's going on with that? What do you think that is?
It's money. Okay. You win a major road marathon in this country, and if you're, I don't know much about the living standards in Kenya, but I have read a bit about it, that some of these guys win one big race and then they retire and they're done. And they go home, buy a farm, get married, have kids, because they're set for life, where they win $100,000 and they're literally set for life.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're not going to win that kind of money. There's no, I don't know that there's any prize money in these mountain races. I think that what we might see, and I think we are beginning to see a little bit of it. I've seen some of it on the Golden Trail series. There are some African runners coming into some of those races, and my guess is it's a little bit like, so this used to happen in cross country skiing. So Norway, again, I'll reference it because it's the kind of the dominant country in cross country skiing. So these young men, in particular, this was getting scholarships for college. These kids would make the national team, and they'd have a year or two in Norway where they would try to make it onto the World Cup level, and they don't make it. They're not quite good enough. They don't have the material. So what did they do? They came over here and they got full ride scholarships to go to school in this country and get an education. I mean, that started happening in the early 70s when I was racing. And, the college teams filled up with Norwegians. And these were all like B-level Norwegian racers, guys who had tried but couldn't make it at the World Cup level. So I'm wondering if we may not see some of that trickle over in running now, where some of these Africans who aren't good enough to win the Chicago Marathon and win, $100,000 or whatever they pay, but they want to have a career as a runner, and they can probably, through sponsorship deals and endorsements and that sort of thing, they can probably still make a decent living. And maybe we'll start to see more of that, some of that crossover from these B-level African runners coming into the mountains. I think there are a few that are already on that circuit. I haven't personally watched them race or seen them race, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to be really fascinating to see in years to come. And maybe some of the fastest individuals are just the fastest because, you know, the talent pool isn't pulled there fully yet. But that's really interesting.
I mean, it's a
to
young
see.
sport. Honestly,
Totally.
mountain
Yeah.
running is still a young sport, and you see this often in young sports. Is that, you know, the fields aren't as thick or as dense. The spread between the we just watched a really interesting race this last week, and it had an athlete in it, the Black Canyon 100K in right outside of Phoenix. And this year, there's only been 10 people ever to break 7 hours and 50 minutes in that race, and 7 of them did it this year.
Wow.
Yeah, this just a week ago, the top 7 people were all under 750, and so it's tightening up. I mean, the sport is maturing. You're beginning to see that happen more and more in mountain running.
Wow. Yeah, that's going to be really fascinating to see. I feel like we've gone a bit off on a tangent here, and you know, I hope this is gonna. I don't know. I hope we can get back to this a little bit. Just, you know, obviously for Kyle and I, and having these serious injuries where we've damaged our ankles and it's kind of really affected our life trajectory. You know, you yourself had quite this foray in 1978. And I'm wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about that story and what that was like for you. And then maybe detail, you know, how did that affect your life trajectory as an athlete and as a coach?
Yeah, I'm thinking like it was for you, no doubt, or anybody who has a serious accident there. You know, it's a life-changing moment, you know, an instant that your life changes. Yeah, I was climbing at quite a high level then. This is, you know, I was mostly interested in winter alpine climbing. And I've been training quite hard that winter. A friend of mine and I went to Alaska. The north buttress of Mount Hunter had never been climbed. Now it's got several routes on it, but at that time had not been climbed. It's about a 4,500 foot rock and ice buttress. And we had our sights on that. We happened to get there. Well, actually, this was the year I graduated from college, and I stayed the day of my finals. I was supposed to stick around and take my professional engineering exams, but I had no real interest in being an engineer at that point. I just thought, well, I'm going to be a professional climber. I mean, I had these, like most 25-year-olds, I had these delusions of grandeur, and I thought I'm going to be the next Reinhold Messner. And so I didn't stick around and take my professional engineering exam. It's the day right after the last final, I was on an airplane to Anchorage. And turns out that year was a very big avalanche, heavy snow year, and a lot of avalanches in the North Buttress. The most famous route on it is called the Moonflower. Then the route that we ended up attempting and getting partway up on, Mark Twight later climbed, and named it Deprivation. Well, it was getting swept by avalanches pretty regularly, and we made 3 attempts on it, each time turning around because of almost getting swept off by avalanches. We were lucky that we happened to be underneath a rock band or whatnot when these seracs would break loose and come tumbling down. And so we turned tail, and finally, after I think 3 attempts, we just decided this is not the year. This thing's not going to happen. And my friend left, said, "Well, if I can't climb that, I'm going home." And I thought, well, heck, we're here on the glacier. I'm going to do something. And so I packed up my my pack, and I skied up. I was on these little, 3-pin lightweight. 3-pin just touring skis, little skinny skis, no metal edges. And I started skiing up the glacier towards Denali, and I wasn't sure what I would want to do. I was just looking for something to climb up there. And I ended up skiing all the way up to about the 14,000 foot plateau that day. And, which is where these days there's a camp there, and there's the rangers have a medical facility and all that there. That particular year, there was a couple of tents, and there was no one there. They were up high. There was another team that was up higher on the mountain, but there was no one at 14 when I got there. And I looked up and I saw this beautiful looking couloir And I thought, well, that looks fantastic. I'm going to try to climb that thing. And so and then a big storm came in and it began to snow heavily. And I thought, well, I'm just going to wait until that thing avalanches and flushes out, and then I'll go climb it. And sure enough, it had a big avalanche. And so I started at about midnight, and I took, I had a fanny pack on, had a water bottle and 2 baby Ruths. And I started up, I had 1 ice axe, and I was trying to go as light as I could. And I climbed this thing and got to the top. And that morning I left at midnight. It was probably mid-May by then. Pretty light all night long. And got to the top, came back down, and was pretty stoked about this whole thing. I mean, at that time, I had no idea if this thing had ever been climbed or not, but it was just a beautiful looking line. It's about 4,500 feet of average angle, about 50 degrees. And it was perfect neve styrofoam ice to go up. So it was quite moderate. Anyway, got back down and I thought, well, that was very successful. It wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. I'm going to go over now and solo the Cassin. And so I thought I would just ski back down to the airstrip and rest up a few days and get some stuff, go back up the northeast fork of the Kahiltna and climb the Cassin. And turned out that route was climbed, I think, next year by someone more famous than me. When I climbed it, I called it the Hourglass Couloir, and it was in Mountain Magazine, it was in Climbing Magazine, and then Reinhold Messner climbed it, and they call it the Messner Couloir now. A little more status than I had. So anyway, I got back. I waited until I rested up after I got back down. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning when I got back to my camp, and it was quite warm then. So I thought I'll wait to ski down till it cools off and things freeze up again. So I started about midnight and started skiing down. I had quite a heavy pack. As you guys know, when you go by yourself in the mountains, your pack is often a lot heavier than it would be if you had a partner. And I was on these little tiny skinny skis, and I skied down to, I don't know, around 11,000 feet or so. And because these skis had these little soft, low top leather boots, they look a little bit like a running shoe. They were like cross-country racing shoes at that time. And so I could only telemark turn with them. Couldn't do a parallel turn. Otherwise, your heels would just pop off the back of the ski and you'd lose control. So I was in the midst of a big sweeping telemark turn to my left, so my right foot was out in front. And I broke through this thick crust, and I went into it up to about my knee, and I went right over the top with my knee stationary, and I made a lot of noise. And so I had to reach down in the hole and release the binding and pull my leg out. And when I did, it looked like my lower leg, it looked like my knee was a universal joint. So I could move around, but my lower leg was not attached. It was like it wasn't attached. It looked like my pants were the only thing that were holding my lower leg on. So I had to grab, like I had some gaiters. I had to grab the gaiter and kind of move my leg back to where it looked like, a more anatomically correct position. It didn't really hurt that much, but it was pretty scary. And I was all by myself. There was no one on the mountain besides these guys that were up at 17,000 feet. We were the only ones on the mountain then. And so I thought, okay, well, it's midnight. What am I going to do? So I started to set up this little tent that I had, thinking, okay, I'm going to crawl in the tent, sleep and gather my wits and do something in the morning. And this was one of the very first tents. Now everybody has a tent that has these poles that are held together by little bungee cords that snap together. And then you slide them into sleeves. Well, I had one of the very first poles of tents that was made with those kinds of poles, and you had to slide them in the sleeves. So I had just gotten the pole bungeed together, and I dropped it, and it slid down and bridged this crevasse about 100 meters away.
Wow.
And I thought, oh God, I had to drag myself with his leg down to there, fish it off, trying to catch it, get it from the edge of the crevasse, bring it back up. It was kind of an ordeal. And then that night before I went to sleep, or tried to go to sleep, I made notes. I thought, I'm going to be delirious with pain tomorrow morning, and I'm going to write down everything I need to do so that I can get out of here. And so I made all these little things that I had to do. And the next morning, pain wasn't that bad, but my knee was the size of a soccer ball.
Oh.
And, luckily it was sort of frozen. It was almost like it was in a splint. So then I took my skis and I lashed my pack on top of the skis. And I lay on top of the pack and pushed with my good leg. And I basically spent the next 2 days dragging myself down to get back to where the airplane landed. And there was no planes flying in because the weather was so bad. But I had flown in with this guy that I knew from Boulder, this guy, the pilot was a bush pilot. He owned Talkeetna Air Service. Yeah. And his name was Jim Sharp. He was from Boulder. And my climbing partner and I had dug the ditch from his septic tank to his house in exchange for him flying us onto the glacier. That was how we got in there. But anyway, I knew Jim a little bit from Boulder. The lady who ran the landing strip then had a radio. They had a woman there who was kind of all the flight service companies had paid for this lady to be in there with a radio to tell them what the weather conditions were like on the glacier. And she called Jim, told him I was there, was hurt. And so every day for 5 days, Jim would fly in and fly around just above the cloud layer. The clouds were almost down right on the glacier. And so he couldn't land, but he'd come in every single day. I could hear him flying around and looking for a hole that he could drop through. And there was one day where there was just a tiny little hole, and he dropped through and landed and turned around and ran over and grabbed me and all my stuff and threw me in the plane and said, "We got to get out of here right away before that hole closes up." And then he took me back to Talkeetna, and I ended up going home and having surgery. And back in 1978, orthopedic surgery was nothing like it is today. The guy who did the surgery was a fellow who worked a lot on some of the Denver Broncos, so he was quite good at knee injuries, but he'd never seen one quite like this before. Because when I finally got my leg out of the hole in the snow, I was looking at the sole of my boot. It was just like the sole of my boot was right about chest level, pointed upward. So it was kind of a creepy situation. And so he put it back together as good as he could. And he just said to me, "You are never going to run again. You will probably need to walk with a cane the rest of your life." And I'm this, peak of fitness, 25-year-old, going to be the best alpinist in the world in my head. And it was a crushing thing. Yeah, it was huge to hear that. And of course, that made me, like probably with you too, when you just became more, when you hear that kind of thing, you say, well, fuck that. I'm not going to let that happen. That's not going to be me. I'm going to do everything I can to get fixed. And I did. I spent a lot of time rehabilitating and training and all that. But it is something you then live with this bum knee for the rest of your life, basically.
What actually happened to your knee anatomically?
I severed all of the ligaments except the medial collateral. And so they were only able to reattach the lateral collateral and the anterior cruciate. So I never had a posterior cruciate after that. And my anterior cruciate was only about like 25%. And I also severed the patellar tendon.
Wow. Was your meniscus damaged at all, or kind of okay?
The meniscus was damaged a little bit, but and I didn't know this until years later when after that I had 7 surgeries to try to, over the next 35 years until I had that knee replaced. I had 7 surgeries to kind of patch it up, to make it go for another couple of years. But in one of those surgeries, I got to watch when they were doing it. They discovered I had about a quarter-sized piece of articular cartilage missing off of the medial condyle of my femur, so that had broken off during that fall, no doubt. And it probably just got pulled out by the surgeon and thrown away into a garbage can somewhere. But later, one of these other surgeon, I had some surgeries done at the Stedman Clinic in Vail, and they said, yeah, you're missing this big chunk of articular cartilage here, and which is eventually what wore that knee out. I just didn't have enough cartilage.
Did you find any of the successive like arthroscopy and stuff really did help your knee for a period of time?
It did. Well, that surgery was open, fully open surgery in 1978. I don't think they even had arthroscopic surgery back then.
But that's what they were scoping it, right?
Well, the other 7, some of them, one of them was open and the other 6 were done arthroscopically. But that first one was, I've got a huge long scar on that knee where they laid it open so they could get at everything. And then now they don't do this at all. People would think this is really crude. Orthopedic surgeons would say this is nuts. They put me in a full-length cast from my ankle to my crotch for 6 months.
What?
Oh, yeah, they wouldn't do that anymore.
to try to get all those ligaments to heal back together. So, of course, they have to keep changing the cast to make it smaller and smaller because my leg was getting skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. I looked like, someone who'd been in a concentration camp, or that leg did. Actually, the only time in my life I've been able to do a one-arm pull-up is when we took that cast off because that leg was so light. But and then of course it didn't bend because I had 6 months of this straight cast. Nowadays, of course, they get you moving the very first day, of surgeries. You're in a machine often that tries to make you keep things moving. So it was a little cruder than it is now, but it served me well. I ski raced on it and ran a lot of miles and climbed a lot of mountains on that bum knee for many years.
Bringing me back to
I'm sure trauma. There's some unpleasant memories for both of you when you hear stories like that. Yeah.
It's just such a devastating injury. And like you said before, it just like instantly your life changes. It's just like right away.
And I was feeling like I was on top of the world. I thought, well, that was a cool thing to do. And now I'm just going to go climb the Cassin. And the next thing, I go from being at that mental state to, it took me, I think it was 7 or 8 days before I even was able to get to see the surgeon. And he said, this is not good. You don't want to be waiting this, because the whole time you've got losing blood flow to those ligaments, and they just start to atrophy and die. And so when I came out of, he said to me when I got to see me, he said, I don't care if you don't want me to do it, but you have to have surgery today or you're going to lose that leg. And I said, okay, do it right now. But it's such a shock to go from when you're at that height of, your own personal pinnacle of, mental and physical state, to then be told that you may never run again. You're going to be walking with a cane the rest of your life. That was pretty tough.
How did you deal with the reasons behind the accident? Like for Max and I, it's pretty cut and dry. Like I was climbing over marginal gear and it failed. Max has his own reasons, but it's easy to digest. It's like, yes, okay, I made a mistake in my judgment, and here I am on the other side. Like, what was that experience like for you in terms of justifying what happened or understanding and coming to a point of acceptance?
Well, probably a lot like yours. It was an error in judgment. I waited until 11 or 12 at night before I left to ski down because I wanted the surface of the glacier to freeze up so I wouldn't break through. And I didn't account for the fact that, dropping from 14,000 to 11,000, that it was going to be warmer down there. And that the crust, at some point, I'd reach a place where the crust wasn't supportable anymore. And these little skis are narrow. They're only about 65. I think that probably what I had was 65 millimeters wide. So they're, what's that? Not even 3 inches, 2.5 inches wide. So they don't float. They don't float very well.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I think it was, again, like in your case, it's just momentary lack of judgment or mistake and not calculating things right.
What about how it changed you for the better?
Well, I think it made me more. I think that was the first time, and I'm sure you had this same experience. I'd never been hurt badly in my life before that. And I had been doing a lot of fairly hard, dangerous. I mean, this was the 70s now. We did not have cams. We were climbing with pitons and hexes and stoppers maybe. And, we were using what they call coat hanger screws for ice screws. You probably have seen those. They look like corkscrews. I mean, climbing was pretty dangerous. And I was managing it fairly well all those years and thinking, and you can begin to feel a little invincible, I think, that, I'm so good that nothing bad can happen to me. And then something like that happens and you realize your mortality and just what a narrow line there is between being in like my case, I was ecstatic with the climb and, the potential now to go solo the Cassine. At that point, the Cassine had not been soloed. It was later when Mug Stump was the first one, I think, to climb it solo. And so I was in pretty much euphoric state and physically really, really fit. I mean, even climbing that, moderately technical route, I was round trip from 14 to the summit and back in, less than 8 hours. So I was moving pretty fast and I wasn't well acclimatized. I hadn't been above about 8,000 feet. So it wasn't like I'd been, and I only spent a day at 14. So I wasn't particularly well acclimated. So I was quite fit. And so I think it threw in my face this realization that, this life is pretty fragile. And I never felt like I was going to die. I realized I was in a rather difficult situation because I'm alone a long way from help, but I never once thought I can't get myself out of this. I thought, okay, it's going to take a while. I'm just going to crawl down the glacier for the next 2 days. But I was never feeling desperate, but it did make me kind of realize, all those other close calls that I'd had in the mountains, if they had just been, a rock fall had been 1 inch different than it was, or avalanche conditions were such, or a fall had been different than it was, I could have been killed. And I don't think I'd ever really, I was 25 years old. And at 25, unless you've had a near-death experience, I don't think you really have an appropriate, a really good appreciation of just how delicate we are. We're not, I don't care who you are, you're still mortal.
Yeah, I resonate with that just so much. I run a POV channel and I film myself climbing and I just play strat gear and I look at who I was as a climber before my accident and I'm just like, if I fall here, I would have died. Like there's just so many moments where you look back and you just realize how close you were to the edge and you were completely oblivious to it. I'm wondering, other than having a near-death experience, how, if at all possible, can we convey that to someone who has not? Like, how can we convey the seriousness and how close we are to the edge of catastrophe without having to put someone through it? Like, is there a way to translate that for somebody?
Boy, I wish there was. I think especially the people who do the kinds of things that we like to do, I think you're not attracted to doing those kinds of things unless you have some sort of sense of invulnerability to start with. Because we all are afraid when we're in situations, like that. When you're 25 feet above your last piece of gear, you're going to be afraid. But it's how you handle that fear. And, the people who manage it and can handle it go on to have, to be able to enjoy the mountains that way. But the people who can't, they quit. They don't do that kind of thing anymore. And so I think that until you've actually, experienced it, I just don't think it's not real for you until it happens. And, and by, through my climbing career, I had a number of friends that were killed and had, and quite a few close calls. One of them actually was with Steve. He and I were descending a peak in Tibet that, and I was behind him in short. We were on a rope, and I was short roping as you like you would do with a guide. And so Steve was maybe 10 feet in front of me, and we were in a whiteout, and we were descending off the summit of this 7,000 meter peak, and the slope fractured between us. And it was about a meter deep fracture. And, if I hadn't had that rope, the short rope on him, he'd have gone. And I didn't even know where he would have ended up because we couldn't see anything. And those kind of things happen, and you just, until you've actually been there and had that happen to you, you just don't realize how close death is sometimes.
And I think it's interesting too, how, people like us have these experiences, whether it be a close call or an actual traumatic injury. And then there's the whole barrier of having to go back with that realization and still have fun. I think that there's a level of fear that creeps in, and a level of understanding of how much peril you can actually be in. Like, how do you, before with ignorance is a bliss, right? You can have fun. You're in control. You're king of the world. You're a master of nature and a master of your physicality. But when that reality is taken away and you realize how close you are, now you have to be like, okay, well, I'm almost like I'm managing death this entire experience, and I still have to have fun somehow. It's an interesting dance to dance.
And I have to say now at 70 that mortality is a lot closer for me than it was. When I came back from that, after that accident, I think I did some of my hardest and more risky climbing later in my life after that. And I'm not sure how or why. I don't know if I don't think I was more cautious, but I can tell you that after probably when I turned about 60, that the risk of injury became a much bigger factor in my climbing and doing anything outdoors, because I know that the older I get, the harder it is to recover from injuries. So I'm much more concerned about not getting hurt anymore, because if I get hurt, it may be the last time I go climbing, because by the time I recover, I'm maybe too old to climb. So I think that has been for your audience that is getting up in the years. That's something I think that we all will deal with, is that your risk tolerance will go down.
Yeah. I
climbed with Colin Haley when he was about half my age. And it was quite clear. I mean, I really liked Colin, and we were a pretty good climbing team, but I realized my risk tolerance as a 50-year-old was nothing like his as a 25-year-old. It was unreasonable. So we didn't climb. We made one trip to Pakistan together, and we had a great time, but it was just apparent to me that I'm not a good partner for him, because our risk tolerances are so different now at those different ages.
Well, I think we're starting to get to the end here, and definitely want to be respectful of your time and stuff, Scott. But, you've kind of alluded to this as yourself, through this process of, aging and your risk tolerance. I'm kind of wondering, what do you feel your legacy is in the climbing community, or what would you like that to be like?
Well, it's certainly not as a climber, I can tell you that. I don't think I didn't really offer anything to the climbing community in terms of my own accomplishments, so I can say that. But I am quite proud of what I've accomplished with these books and with the businesses I've started, and in terms of helping climbers perform better, especially in on the endurance end of the spectrum. I'm never considered myself like a rock climbing coach or technical coach of any sort, and so I'm quite proud of that accomplishment, maybe more so than almost anything else I've done in my life, because I feel like the lessons that I've been able to explain and hand over in these books are, it's a lifetime worth of knowledge. Some of it based on, my experiential, what I learned from either from coaching people or being an athlete myself, and others from studying a great deal. And because I didn't have, a schooling in the exercise sciences, I had to read a lot to try to figure this stuff out. And what I think I was able to do in that process was connect a lot of disconnected data points. And, I'd never read in one place what I've tried to put in those books in terms of an explanation of how endurance works. I'd read a little bit in one place, or I'd read a study that talked about this thing, or I'd read about some coaching principles that talked about another thing. And I tried to bring them together and go, oh, this is why it works that way. And then explain it to other people in a language that's not so technical. I mean, you don't, as I often say to people, you don't need to know every step of the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria to understand how important your aerobic system is to endurance and how that needs to be stressed. I mean, it's kind of interesting and fun to know some of that stuff, but if it can be explained in a way that we can get the point across to people, then I feel like I've been successful with that to a large degree because I've gotten a lot of feedback from folks. So I'd say that that's my legacy is that, because when Steve approached me about writing this book after Steve had his bad accident on Mount Temple in 2010, I think. And he wrote the memoir that he put out called Beyond the Mountain. And he was on book tour with that. I think maybe it was 2011. I was in Norway coaching World Cup skiers, and I was on a Skype call with Steve one night. And I asked him how the book tour was going. And he said, it's going great. But people are asking me, how did you train to do all that stuff? And he finally kind of developed this glib one-liner and said, well, I could tell you, but it would take a whole book. And he said, I think we should write down what we did. And I was quite resistant. I said, who would care? I don't think anybody's going to care about nobody trains for mountaineering or alpinism. And I said, we'd be lucky to sell a few dozen copies. And finally, he convinced me to do it. And we ended up writing the book, and it's sold, many, many, many thousands of copies now. And so I credit him for pushing me into doing that. And that was quite a learning experience as well, because I was no author. I'd never written anything. A few articles, training articles, and I'd given some lectures and talks, but nothing as substantial as a whole book. So it was that was a great learning experience for me, something that, I cherish now that I've been able to put together. And I realized that it did actually change the way people approach the mountains. We see more and more people that are interested in training more like an athlete before they go into the mountains.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good place to start wrapping up here. Kyle, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think topic wise, we're there. I think, I second that with your legacy here, Scott. I think that you've added something extremely valuable to the community that people can use for a lifetime. So, I mean, I commend your effort, and, I own your book, and, whereas I haven't, taken my athletic, potential seriously as I could, it has shaped, how I view entering the mountains, and I'm sure it has for lots of people. So, I thank you on behalf of everybody for your contribution.
Thanks for that compliment.
Yeah. In general, not to beat a dead horse too many times here, but yeah, absolutely. Scott, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, or when we were talking originally, I really do accredit you and this individual, Terry Louie, who kind of mentored me in climbing, as the individuals that created this spark in my life. And training for the new alpinism absolutely transformed my life. I actually met you in a Patagonia store. I mean, you were signing 1 million books, so I don't really expect you to remember, but it was this really, really just unbelievable, influential journey for me. And I think you express this really well. The book disseminates a lot of very, very complex principles in a very concise, way, and it's all in one place. And so for anybody looking to just improve their fitness, their health, to get better into endurance sports or the mountains, I couldn't recommend that book enough. I've got my copy here. It is really an amazing body of work. And so, to anybody listening to the show here, I highly recommend you go buy a copy, check it out, and check Scott's website out, evokeendurance.com. They've got tons of coaches, lots of athletes, tons of resources, blogs, training plans. It's really just an unbelievable resource to go learn. And once again, to reiterate, if you're not purchasing things, it's still an amazing resource. They have tons of great information there. So please go check them out. And Scott, I just want to say thanks so much for your time this evening and coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation with you guys. I wish you well. I hope your ankle's going to provide you with a lot of locomotion for the rest of your lives.
Yeah, me too. Maybe we'll have to go find that Bronco surgery and hope he has a son who's been doing football ankles for the whole time.
I bet you there's going to be ankle replacements before you need them.